Chapter 1. An Africa Before Colonization. Before intensive European colonization in the late 19th century, Africa was a continent full of diverse societies, empires, and trade networks. The population lived in different political, economic, and social structures, from small tribal communities to city-states and large such as Mali, Songhai, Congo, or the Zulu. These cultures were complex, organized, and closely connected with one another through trade, religion, and alliances. The economy in Africa was strongly regionalized and interconnected. Agriculture formed the foundation, with fertile areas producing grain, cassava, yams, and millet. Cattle breeding played a central role, especially in the Sahel zone, while fishing and trade dominated in coastal regions. Regions such as present-day Mali and Niger benefited from trans-Saharan trade. Salt, gold, copper, and textiles were transported over long distances, and trading cities such as Timbuktu, Gao, or Djenné became cultural and economic centers. Culturally and religiously, Africa was diverse and dynamic. While Islam was widespread in the north and west, many southern regions practiced traditional African religions, which often combined animistic elements with ancestor worship. Music, dance, craftsmanship, and oral tradition were essential parts of everyday life, and served both entertainment and social and religious communication. Politically, different forms of organization existed. Some regions were centralized in strong empires and kingdoms, such as Mali, Songhai, or the Kingdom of Congo. Other areas consisted of loose tribal confederations, or city-states, that were connected with one another through trade, alliances, and military power. These structures made a certain degree of stability, flexibility, and adaptability to climatic, economic, and political changes possible. Another important aspect was Africa's international interconnectedness even before the colonial period. Coastal regions traded with Arabs, Indians, Portuguese, and later also with the Dutch and the British. Products such as gold, ivory, spices, and enslaved people were in demand and led to economic prosperity, but also to conflicts and migrations within the continent. African societies were by no means passive actors. They actively shaped trade, diplomacy, and military conflicts, which underlined their political and economic autonomy. In summary, Africa before colonization was a complex, culturally and economically diverse continent. The population lived in political structures that ranged from tribal organizations to powerful kingdoms, and practiced trade, agriculture, and craftsmanship at a high level. Religion, culture, and education shaped social life, while trade and exchange networks created an early form of globalization. These initial conditions show that Africa was not undeveloped or primitive, as it was often portrayed in colonial narratives, but rather a continent with dynamic, self-determined societies that later faced the European colonial powers. In the next chapter, we will examine the early European contacts, the beginnings of trade, the first expeditions of Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch sailors, and the foundations for later colonization. Chapter 2. Early European contacts. The early European contacts with Africa go back to the 15th and 16th centuries, when sailors from Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and later other European states began systematically exploring the African coast. These contacts were initially motivated above all by economic interests, but in the long term they had profound political, social, and cultural consequences. Portugal played a pioneering role in this process. Sailors such as Henry the Navigator initiated expeditions along the West African coast in order to gain access to gold, ivory, and other valuable resources. The Portuguese established the first trading posts, so-called forts, in regions such as Senegambia, Angola, and Mozambique. These trading stations served not only the exchange of goods, but also acted as starting points for further exploration and later control of coastal areas. Alongside the economic interest in gold, ivory, and exotic goods came the beginning of the slave trade. European traders began exchanging African captives for goods, or later using them as laborers for overseas plantations. African societies were not passive victims in this process. Local rulers and merchants actively shaped trade and diplomacy, negotiated prices, and formed alliances. Nevertheless, this dynamic led in the long term to destabilized regions, violence, and social upheaval. The Spanish focused above all on northwest Africa and the Canary Islands, while the Dutch began in the 17th century to establish trading stations on the west coast and in southern Africa. These early contacts were largely limited to coastal regions because the interior was difficult for Europeans to access and was controlled by local kingdoms and tribal associations. Trade and diplomacy were strongly influenced by existing African power structures, which often imposed conditions on Europeans before granting them access to resources. Culturally and religiously, these contacts initially played a secondary role. Missionaries began to accompany Portuguese activity, especially in Angola and Mozambique. But the main motivation was trade and the maximization of economic profit. Only later, in the 19th century, did religious missionary work take on a central role in ideologically justifying European expansion. Europe's technological and navigational advances made this expansion possible. New ships, more precise maps, compasses, and navigational instruments allowed Europeans to penetrate farther inland, secure ports, and build trade networks. These advances changed not only trade, but also laid the groundwork for later colonization, since coastal control and the first projections of power were decisive for later inland expansion. Politically, the early contacts led to a shift of power along the coasts. European trading posts offered protection against rivals and made it possible to exert influence on local rulers. In many cases, conflicts occurred, but alliances also emerged. African kings used the new trading opportunities to strengthen their position against neighbors, creating a complex web of diplomacy, trade, and military pressure. In summary, the early European contacts with Africa laid the foundation for later colonization. Trade, exploration, and technological advances made it possible to build the first centers of power along the coasts. At the same time, African societies actively influenced these processes, turning trade, diplomacy, and military interaction into a complex network. The beginning of the transatlantic slave trade and the establishment of trading stations were the first steps in a profound transformation that would bring Africa into the focus of European expansion in the 19th century. In the next chapter, we will examine the transatlantic slave trade and its effects on African societies, economies, and cultures in detail. Chapter 3. The Transatlantic Slave Trade. Transatlantic slave trade, which flourished between the 16th and 19th centuries, was one of the most profound and tragic forms of European influence on Africa. Millions of people from West and Central Africa were violently abducted, shipped to the Americas, and forced to work on plantations, in mines, and in households. This trade had not only economic consequences, but also political, social, and cultural consequences that shaped the continent for centuries. The trade began above all through the Portuguese, who initially controlled coastal regions such as Angola and Congo. Later, the Dutch, English, French, and Spanish entered the trade, and it developed into a transatlantic system that connected Africa, Europe, and the Americas. African ports became transshipment points for people, goods, and weapons, and European traders often worked with local rulers who sold prisoners of war, captives from rival tribes, or their own subjects. The economic dimension was central. Enslaved labor made possible the cultivation of sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee in the New World, which increased of European colonial powers. At the same time, some of the produced goods flowed back to Africa, including weapons, metals, and textiles, which influenced existing power structures in African societies. Regions that were actively involved in the trade initially experienced economic advantages. In the long term, however, violence, depopulation, and social destabilization caused far-reaching damage. Politically, the slave trade intensified local conflicts. Rival groups were played against one another. Wars and raids increased, and political power was increasingly determined by control over people and trade. Many kingdoms and city-states developed into trading powers that deliberately supplied captives in order to profit from European markets. At the same time, the social cohesion of many regions was undermined as families, village communities, and tribal structures were torn apart. Socially and culturally, the slave trade left deep marks. Millions of people were robbed of their homeland, identity, language, and culture. Demography changed. Young men and women were deported on a large scale, which affected population growth, family structures, and economic production. At the same time, diasporic communities emerged in the Americas that preserved African culture, music, religion, and language, and developed new cultural forms. The transport across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was especially brutal. People were transported on ships under catastrophic conditions. Hunger, disease, and violence led to extremely high death rates. According to estimates, about 15 to 20% of those abducted died during the transport before they reached the coasts of the Americas. This experience shaped the collective memory of the diaspora and left a deep historical imprint that remains active in culture, society, and political memory to this day. The role of African societies must not be overlooked. Many rulers, merchants, and warriors actively traded with European powers, negotiated prices, determined delivery quantities, and used the trade to secure power and prestige. Nevertheless, the long-term dependence on the European slave trade led to social fragmentation, the underdevelopment of certain regions, and the weakening of political structures. In summary, the transatlantic slave trade was a multifactorial catastrophe for Africa. Economic benefit, power politics, and European expansion stood in stark contrast to the social, cultural, and demographic consequences for the continent. Millions of people were uprooted, local societies were destabilized, and political structures were undermined. At the same time, the slave trade shaped the African diaspora, created transatlantic trade networks, and laid the foundation for later colonial interventions, which reached their peak in the 19th century. In the next chapter, we will examine the great African empires in the 18th and 19th centuries, their structures, economic systems and reactions to increasing European influence. Chapter 4. African Empires in the 18th and 19th centuries. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Africa was not a continent without states, but was shaped by powerful kingdoms, complex societies, and flourished trade centers that possessed far-reaching political, economic, and cultural structures. Despite the growing European presence along the coasts, many African empires were able to maintain their sovereignty and economic autonomy well into the 19th century. One of the most important West African empires was the Ashanti Empire in present-day Ghana. It was highly organized politically, with a central king, the Asantehene, and a sophisticated system of regional governors. Economically, the empire benefited from trade in gold, kola nuts, ivory, and enslaved people. The Ashanti were militarily strong, organized standing armies, and carried out strategic campaigns to expand spheres of influence or secure trade routes. This military strength made the empire a respected and feared actor in West Africa. In the Sahel region, Mali and Songhai gained historical importance. Although Songhai had already been weakened in the 16th century, political structures and trade networks continued to exist. Cities such as Timbuktu and Gao were important centers of education, Islamic religion, trade, and scholarship. Universities and Quranic schools attracted scholars from all over West Africa, and trade in salt, gold, and textiles connected the region with North Africa and beyond. These empires showed that Africa developed its own economic and educational systems over centuries, independently of European influence. In southern Africa, the Zulu kingdom emerged in the 19th century and reached a military and political high point under Shaka Zulu. Through innovative war tactics, strict organization of warriors, and the centralization of power, the Zulu were able to control large parts of present-day KwaZulu-Natal. The expansion of the Zulu led to social restructuring, but also to an effective state system that promoted trade, agriculture, and cultural unity. In Central Africa, the Kingdom of Congo continued to play an important role, even though Portuguese influence on the coast had increased since the 16th century. The Kingdom of Congo used trade and diplomacy to maintain control over resources such as ivory, copper, and later enslaved people. The political structure was complex, with a central king, regional governors, and a network of vassals that made it possible to administer large territories. East Africa was shaped by trade networks along the coast, especially through cities such as Mombasa, Kilwa, and Zanzibar. These cities traded in spices, ivory, and enslaved people, and were in close contact with Arab, Indian, and later European traders. The city-states were politically independent, culturally shaped by Islam, and developed their own administrative systems that organized trade, taxes, and diplomacy. Economically, these empires depended on regional trade, agricultural production, and craftsmanship. Local markets, barter, mines, and plantations secured prosperity, while social structures were closely tied to families, clans, and political loyalty. African rulers also used trade as an instrument of political power. Whoever controlled access to trade routes could exert influence over neighboring states and accumulate wealth. Culturally, religion, education, and art shaped life in these empires. Islamic education in the Sahel, Christian missionary activity in Central Africa, and traditional African religions in the South and West formed a diverse religious spectrum. Craftsmanship, music, dance, architecture, and oral tradition were central elements of social identity and contributed to the political legitimacy of rulers. In summary, African empires in the 18th and 19th centuries were politically stable, economically active, and culturally rich. Despite the growing European presence, many empires retained their sovereignty, developed their own trade networks and military systems, and shaped the social structures of their regions. This complexity shows that Africa before colonization was a continent of independent states and societies that actively responded to internal and external challenges. In the next chapter, we will examine the motivations of European colonial powers in the 19th century. Economic, political, ideological, and religious reasons for expansion in Africa. Chapter 5. The motivation of European colonial powers. The massive colonization of Africa in the 19th century was not a random event, but the result of various economic, political, ideological, and religious motivations of European powers. The countries of Europe pursued strategies that included both economic interests, such as raw material extraction and control of trade, and political prestige projects. Ideology and religion often served as justification for expansion. A central economic factor was Europe's industrialization. Countries such as Great Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium needed raw materials for the emerging factories. Rubber, cotton, gold, diamonds, coffee, and palm oil were only some of the desired products. Africa's immense natural resources appeared to be an inexhaustible source that would secure industrial production and trade. At the same time, African coastal regions and river systems opened new markets for European manufactured goods, making colonies attractive not only as suppliers of raw materials, but also as sales markets. Politically, power and prestige played a decisive role. In the age of nationalism, colonial expansion was considered a symbol of a country's strength and modernity. The more territory a state controlled, the greater its international prestige. Especially after the establishment of the German Empire in 1871, European powers attempted to expand their influence globally in order to secure the balance of power and status in Europe. Colonies became instruments of geopolitical strategy, used to reduce rivalries and secure access to trade and resources. Another aspect was ideological in nature. The belief in the superiority of European culture and civilization served as a justification for colonial rule. The idea that Africa had to be civilized, often called the white man's burden, connected Western missionary work, education, infrastructure projects, and administration with imperial interests. This ideology helped morally legitimize colonization and minimize resistance within the European population. Religion also played a central role. Missionaries, especially from Catholic and Protestant churches, accompanied expansion in order to spread the Christian faith. Missions served not only religious goals, but also political ones. They supported colonial administrations through education, translation, medical care, and the integration of local societies into colonial structures. Missionary work was closely linked to Europe's claim of civilization. Technological advances further facilitated expansion. Steamships, railways, telegraphy, and modern weapons enabled European powers to control African territories effectively, secure trade, and enforce military superiority against local resistance. These technologies made colonialism more efficient and less risky, which meant that even countries with limited military resources were able to rule large territories. Another economic aspect was control over strategic trade routes. The Suez Canal, the Nile, the Congo, the Niger, and important coastal regions became central nodes of world trade. Whoever controlled these areas could dominate access to markets, resources, and transport routes, while also securing their own geopolitical influence. In summary, the European colonization of Africa was motivated by multiple factors: economic interests, industrial raw material needs, national prestige projects, ideological beliefs, and religious mission formed a closely connected network that brought the continent into the focus of European expansion. This motivation laid the foundation for the intensive territorial partition of Africa, which in the late 19th century led to the so-called Scramble for Africa, a race for control of the entire continent. In the next chapter, we'll examine the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 and the formal partition of Africa by the European powers in detail. The rules, mechanisms, and consequences of this colonial reordering. Chapter 6. The Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was a central turning point in the colonization of Africa and marked the beginning of the systematic partition of the continent among European powers. The goal of the conference was to regulate the growing tensions between Great Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and other colonial powers, minimize trade conflicts, and formally legitimize control over African territories. The conference was convened on the initiative of Otto von Bismarck, the German Chancellor. It was intended to ensure that European powers would not divide Africa in an uncoordinated and conflict-ridden way, but would instead develop clear rules for colonial claims. Bismarck did not understand the conference primarily as a humanitarian measure, but as a strategic instrument to legitimize Germany's colonial ambitions, while at the same time diffusing European rivalries. A central result of the Berlin Conference was the principle of effective occupation. European states could make territorial claims in Africa only if they actually exercised control over the land through administration, military presence, or trading stations. This principle meant that theoretical claims on maps had no legal effect unless backed by practical control, military presence, and infrastructure. The conference also laid the foundations for the international recognition of colonial rule. Borders between colonies were established, often without regard for local ethnic, cultural, or political structures. This led to communities that had previously been independent or organized under local rulers becoming a part of foreign administrative territories overnight. The long-term social tensions that resulted from this still shape many African states today. Another important point was the recognition of the prohibition of trade and freedom of trade. Officially, the powers committed themselves to fighting the international slave trade and allowing free trade along rivers and coasts. In practice, these regulations often served as a pretext to justify military interventions or suppress local resistance, while the economic benefit of the colonies for the European powers remained the priority. The conference strengthened Germany's role as a colonial power, even though the country had entered the competition late. Germany received territories such as German Southwest Africa, Togo, Cameroon, and German East Africa, which it could now formally claim. At the same time, Great Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, and other powers secured their spheres of influence in West and Central Africa, as well as in Southern and Eastern Africa. The conference had far-reaching political and social consequences for Africa. Partition without regard for local structures. Ethnic groups, kingdoms, and tribal associations were often cut apart or thrown together. Military interventions. States that had previously been independent were now militarily subjugated in order to enforce the claims of the colonial powers. Economic control. European powers established monopolies over raw materials, infrastructure, and trade, strongly influencing the local economy. Long-term conflict potential. The artificially drawn borders laid the foundation for later ethnic conflicts, political tensions, and civil wars. In summary, the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was the official starting signal for the intensive colonization of Africa. It standardized the rules for European expansion, established borders, and led to the systematic, almost continent-wide control of Africa by European powers. The decisions made in Berlin had deep and long-lasting effects on Africa's political, economic, and social structures, and remain a central reference point for understanding modern African history. In the next chapter, we will examine British colonial policy in detail with examples from Egypt, South Africa, and Nigeria, its strategies, administrative models, and economic interests. Chapter 7. British colonial policy. British colonial policy in Africa in the 19th century was shaped by a mixture of economic exploitation, strategic control, and political pragmatism. Great Britain pursued an expansion that was intended to secure both important trade routes and access to raw materials, especially for the Industrial Revolution. At the same time, the empire relied on flexible administrative systems that partly used local structures in order to minimize costs and resistance. A central goal of the British was control over strategically important regions such as Egypt, where the Nile and access to the Mediterranean were of central importance for trade with India and Southeast Asia. In 1882, British troops took de facto control of Egypt in order to secure the Suez Canal route, an indispensable access point to the colonies in India. Although Egypt formally remained under Ottoman sovereignty, Great Britain established a de facto, or veiled, protectorate administration that controlled economic resources, expanded infrastructure, and decisively influenced political decisions. In South Africa, British colonial policy was especially complex. Here the British encountered the already established Boer republics, which had formed from Dutch settlers. The conflict between Boers and British led to the Boer Wars of 1880 to 1881 and 1899 to 1902, during which the British military controlled strategic regions such as the gold and diamond mines. The British introduced modern administrative methods, military bases, and control systems while trying to integrate the local African population into economic production, but at the same time politically marginalizing it. Another example was Nigeria, where Great Britain first established trade contacts and military bases before the territory was systematically colonized. By using local rulers and existing political structures, a system later known as indirect rule, the British were able to gain control over large territories without building an expensive, comprehensive administration. Local chiefs formally remained in power, but they had to collect taxes, enforce, and provide military support. But this model reduced resistance and increased the efficiency of British colonial administration. Economically, the British pursued a clear strategy. The colonies supplied raw materials that were necessary for British industrial production, including cotton, coffee, rubber, gold, and diamonds. At the same time, the colonies became sales markets for British manufactured goods. Infrastructure projects such as railways, roads, and ports primarily served raw material extraction and export, but also improved trade within the colonies in the long term. Culturally and ideologically, the British tried to spread the idea of the civilizing mission. Schools, churches, and mijmishd were used to promote European education, religion, and culture. The goal was to accustom the local population to European norms, create loyalty, and stabilize control over the long term. Nevertheless, African societies and cultures were not completely erased. They adapted, resisted, or integrated European elements into existing traditions. In summary, British colonial policy combined economic exploitation, strategic control, pragmatic administration, and ideological justification. Through indirect rule, protectorates, and military presence, the British were able to effectively control wide parts of Africa, secure their economic interests, and administer them at relatively low cost. The British strategy differed from the direct repressive control used by other powers and shaped the political structures of numerous African states into the present. In the next chapter, we will examine French colonial policy, its expansion in West Africa and North Africa, administrative systems, economic strategies, and cultural approaches. Chapter 8. French colonial policy. French colonial policy in Africa differed in several ways from the British strategy. Even though both powers pursued the goal of economic and political control, France aimed for a more comprehensive direct administration that emphasized integration and assimilation of the African population into the colonial system. At the same time, French expansions connected economic interests with ideological goals such as the spread of language, culture, and administrative methods. One focus of French colonial policy lay in West Africa, where territories such as Senegal, Mali, formerly French Sudan, Niger, Côte d'Ivoire, and Burkina Faso were systematically brought under French control. France relied on the model of direct rule, in which European officials directly took over administration, jurisdiction, and tax collection. Local rulers were often replaced or strongly controlled, while the colonial administration established a uniform structure based on French law and bureaucracy. In North Africa, especially in Algeria, France pursued a particularly intense form of colonization. Algeria was conquered militarily in 1830 and eventually integrated into the French state. The French government relied on land seizure by settlers, the creation of European towns, and the restructuring of agriculture. This colonization was especially repressive because the local population was uprooted, dispossessed, and partly forced to live under French control. Another characteristic of French colonial policy was cultural assimilation. France aimed to turn the colonized into French people. Schools, missions, and administrative practices were used to teach French language, law, and culture. Children of African elites were educated in French schools, often far from their home regions, in order to create a loyal administrative elite that supported the colonial administration. This produced an educated class that internalized European values, but at the same time often stood in tension with traditional societies. Economically, France pursued a strategy of raw material extraction and infrastructure development. Railways, ports, and roads were built to transport raw materials such as cotton, rubber, ivory, gold, and agricultural products for export to France. At the same time, colonies were used as markets for French manufactured goods. Plantation agriculture, mining, and trade stood at the center of the colonial economy, often to the disadvantage of local economic structures. Militarily, France relied on control through strong armies in order to suppress resistance. Uprisings, such as the famous resistance in Algeria or in Senegal, were violently crushed. Military presence was central both to enforce political authority and to secure trade routes and economic infrastructure. Another characteristic of French colonial policy was ideological assimilation. France aimed to turn the colonized into French people. Schools, missions, and administrative practices were used to teach French language, law, and culture. Children of African elites were educated in French schools, often far from their home regions, in order to create a loyal administrative elite that supported the colonial administration. This produced an educated class that internalized European values, but at the same time often stood in tension with traditional societies. Economically, France pursued a strategy of raw material extraction and infrastructure development. Railways, ports, and roads were built to transport raw materials such as cotton, rubber, ivory, gold, and agricultural products for export to France. At the same time, colonies were used as markets for French manufactured goods. Plantation agriculture, mining, and trade stood at the center of the colonial economy, often to the disadvantage of local economic structures. Militarily, France relied on control through strong armies in order to suppress resistance. Uprisings such as the famous resistance in Algeria or in Senegal were violently crushed. Military presence was central both to enforce political authority and to secure trade routes and economic infrastructure. Ideologically, France connected economic and military goals with the idea of a civilizing mission, often promoted under the slogan Mission Civilisatrice. The claim of civilizing African societies served as justification for interventions in local power structures, the introduction of European administrative practices, and the cultural transformation of the population. In summary, French colonial policy was characterized by direct rule, cultural assimilation, economic exploitation, and military control. While British colonies often functioned through indirect administration, France aimed to integrate and transform African societies more strongly. The French strategy marks deep the education, language, administration, and culture of the colonized regions and shaped the political and social structures of many West and North African states into the present. In the next chapter, we will examine Belgian colonial policy in the Congo, one of the most brutal and most notorious forms of European colonization in Africa, marked by economic exploitation and massive human rights violations. Chapter 9. Belgian colonial policy in the Congo. The colonization of the Congo by Belgium is considered one of the most brutal and inhuman forms of European expansion in Africa. Under the rule of King Leopold II, the territory of today's Democratic Republic of the Congo was initially claimed as the king's personal property before it officially became a Belgian colony in 1908. Belgian policy in the Congo was characterized by extreme economic exploitation, forced labor, and massive human rights violations that deeply traumatized the African population. King Leopold II pursued the goal of maximizing the resources of the Congo, especially rubber, ivory, and timber. To achieve these goals, he established a system of forced labor in which men were forced to work on plantations, rubber collection, and infrastructure projects. Those who failed to meet quotas were punished, often with mutilation, torture, or execution. Historians estimate that during this period, millions of people lost their lives or were permanently harmed. The administration of the Congo was highly centralized and militarized. The Belgian colonial government relied on private companies and the Force Publique, a military unit responsible for enforcing forced labor and suppressing uprisings. These structures made it possible for a small European elite to effectively control a vast and diverse territory without involving the local population in decision-making processes. Economically, Belgian colonial policy was oriented exclusively toward the interests of Europe. Infrastructure projects, such as railways, roads, and ports, primarily served the transport of raw materials to Brussels and other European cities. Local economic development or the needs of the African population were largely ignored. This form of exploitation led to deep ecological and social destruction, as agricultural production and traditional ways of life were radically disrupted. The social consequences were dramatic. Forced labor destroyed social structures, depopulated entire regions, and led to famines, disease, and migration. Families were torn apart. Village communities were destabilized, and traditional power structures were weakened. At the same time, African societies were traumatized, which further facilitated colonial rule. Culturally and politically, Belgian colonization left deep marks. Education, religion, and local administration were almost exclusively controlled by European institutions. Missionaries played a role in religious indoctrination, while political participation by indigenous people was almost completely excluded. This meant that the African population remained excluded from power and decision-making over the long term, and that political structures stood fully under European control. Belgian policy in the Congo shows in an exemplary way how economic greed, European prestige, and technological superiority could combine to produce extreme violence and exploitation. International protests against Leopold's crimes forced Belgium in 1908 to officially take over the Congo as a colony and end Leopold's system of personal rule. Nevertheless, the social and economic structures remained strongly shaped by the effects of brutal exploitation. In summary, Belgian colonial policy in the Congo was characterized by extreme economic exploitation, forced labor, violence, and oppression. It represents one of the darkest chapters of African colonial history and left deep scars in the society, economy, and politics of the Congo, whose consequences are still felt today. In the next chapter, we will examine the German colonies in Africa, focusing on German Southwest Africa, Togo, and Cameroon. Their administrative models, economic strategies, and the resistance of the local population. Chapter 10. German colonies in Africa. The colonial policy of the German Empire in Africa began late, but it was characterized by strong military control, economic exploitation, and the enforcement of European rule. Germany entered the colonial race only in the 1880s, but within a short time it acquired several territories: German Southwest Africa, today Namibia, Cameroon, Togo, and German East Africa, today Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. The German colonies were characterized by systematic administration, military subjugation, and often brutal repression, with the resistance of the local population playing a central role. In German Southwest Africa, one of the most shocking events of German colonial history occurred: the Herero and Nama uprising and genocide from 1904 to 1908. The Herero and Nama rebelled against land dispossession, forced labor, and the arbitrary violence of the German colonial administration. The German military leadership responded with extreme violence, drove parts of the population into the desert, imprisoned people in concentration camps, and used modern weapons and systematic strategies of extermination. Estimates suggest that about 65,000 Herero and 10,000 Nama lost their lives. This event is considered one of the first genocides of the 20th century. In German East Africa, Germany relied on a combination of military presence and administrative integration. The colony was controlled through governors, officials, and the so-called Schutztruppe system. The population had to pay taxes, provide labor, and was compelled to produce agricultural export goods such as cotton and coffee. Here, too, uprisings occurred and were sometimes brutally suppressed, including the Maji-Maji uprising of 1905 to 1907, during which several 100,000 people died. The colonies of Cameroon and Togo were smaller by comparison, but economically significant. Germany built plantations, promoted trade networks, and constructed infrastructure projects such as roads, ports, and railway lines in order to export raw materials such as palm oil, rubber, and cocoa. Here, too, the empire relied on a mixture of military control and forced labor, while local rulers were partly integrated into the administration to minimize resistance. Economically, export orientation stood in the foreground. The colonies served primarily to supply raw materials for German industry. Plantation agriculture, mining, and monopoly trade dominated the economy, while traditional African structures were suppressed or redirected. The infrastructure built by the colonial rulers served primarily profit maximization, and not the social development of the population. Militarily, the German Empire was willing to use brutal violence to secure control. Schutztruppen were equipped with modern weapons and proceeded systematically against uprisings. This military harshness served not only suppression, but was also meant to act as a deterrent example for other regions in order to secure Germany's colonial claim. Ideologically, Germany connected economic interests with the idea of a civilizing mission, similar to other colonial powers. Missionaries, schools, and administration were supposed to educate the African population and integrate it into European values, although coercion and violence were often the dominant means. In summary, the German colonies in Africa were characterized by military harshness, economic exploitation, infrastructure projects, and sometimes brutal repression. Resistance by the African population was often bloodily suppressed, making Germany's colonial history one of the most violent in Africa. Despite the short colonial period, German measures left deep marks in the society, economy, and politics of the affected regions. In the next chapter, we will examine the Portuguese colonies, Angola and Mozambique, and investigate how Portugal maintained and economically used its colonial rule despite limited resources and international pressure. Chapter 11. Portuguese colonies in Africa. Portugal is one of the oldest colonial powers in Africa, and had possessed bases along the coasts of West and East Africa since the 15th century. In the 19th century, Portuguese colonial policy focused on controlling Angola and Mozambique, where Portugal was able to maintain its rule despite limited resources, military inferiority compared with other European powers, and strong resistance by the local population. Portuguese colonial policy, partially shaped by economic interests. In Angola and Mozambique, resources such as rubber, coffee, cotton, sugar, and ivory were exploited. Portugal relied on forced labor systems that compelled the indigenous population to work on plantations and in mines. Unlike the British, who often used indirect rule, or the French with their assimilation model, Portugal pursued a direct, strongly controlling administration that suppressed and centralized local power structures. Militarily, Portugal relied on a combination of small European units and local auxiliary troops to crush uprisings and maintain control over wide areas. Resistance by the indigenous population was especially persistent in Angola. Numerous uprisings and guerrilla wars forced the Portuguese to steadily increase their military presence, which placed enormous strain on the colonial administration. An important instrument of Portuguese colonial policy was securing revenue through customs duties and taxes. Plantation owners and colonial authorities demanded payments from the local population, which often had to be provided in the form of labor services or goods. This system led to social tensions and contributed to the uprooting of traditional structures. Culturally and ideologically, Portugal used missionary work and language to stabilize control. Catholic missionaries built schools, churches, and hospitals with a focus on religious instruction and European education. The introduction of the Portuguese language and administrations served the integration of the colonies into the imperial system, but at the same time undermined local languages, traditions, and education systems. Portuguese strategy was strongly defensive. Portugal did not have the economic or military resources to effectively colonize large areas in the way France or Great Britain could. For that reason, the colonial power concentrated on coastal cities, trade routes, and river courses that made control over trade and resources possible. The interior remained partly autonomous, but was increasingly integrated into the colonial system through military interventions and tribute obligations. The effects on the population were considerable. Forced labor, land dispossession, military violence, and the introduction of European administration undermined traditional power structures. Many communities were uprooted, and migration or resettlement became everyday strategies to evade colonial control. Despite these repressions, African societies remained resilient and repeatedly organized local uprisings and guerrilla wars that challenged Portuguese colonial rule. In summary, the Portuguese colonies in Angola and Mozambique were characterized by direct rule, economic exploitation, forced labor, and military oppression. Portugal used missionary work and administration to secure control, but compared with other European powers, it was able to mobilize fewer resources. The African population responded with resistance and adaptation, which made colonial rule permanently unstable and sustainably changed Africa's social, economic, and political structures. In the next chapter, we will examine the Italian colonies in Africa, Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia, and investigate how Italy implemented its late colonial ambitions, what strategies it used, and how the local population responded. Chapter 12. Italian colonies in Africa. Italy entered the colonial race relatively late compared with other European powers. After the unification of Italy in 1861, the new kingdom wanted to strengthen its international status and looked for territories in Africa in order to secure prestige, economic advantages, and military presence. The most important Italian colonies were established in Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia. Italian colonial policy was characterized by military violence, insufficient economic infrastructure, and partly unstable administration, which still marks Italy's colonial legacy today. In Libya, Italy began the war against the Ottoman Empire in 1911, as the empire had previously controlled the region. The war was brutal, and Italian military rule met fierce resistance from the local population, especially from the Senussi tribes and other resistance groups. The Italians established military bases and forced administrations, suppressed uprisings, and carried out massacres, in some cases in order to secure control. Despite military presence, integrating Libya into the Italian colonial system remained difficult and expensive. In Eritrea, which Italy had controlled since the 1880s, the colonial power relied on direct military occupation and the establishment of European administrative structures. Italian settlers received land, while the local population was obliged to provide labor services and pay taxes. The colony served as a strategic harbor on the Red Sea and as a starting point for further expansion in East Africa, especially toward Somalia and Ethiopia. Somalia was divided into several regions which were partly controlled directly by Italy and partly through local allies. The Italian administration relied on forced labor, military presence, and alliances with local clans in order to suppress resistance. However, the population repeatedly responded with uprisings, which were often brutally crushed. Infrastructure projects such as roads, ports, and small plantations served primarily military and economic control, not the development of local society. Economically, the Italian colonies were strongly focused on raw material production and agricultural yields. Sugar, cotton, coffee, and cattle breeding stood in the foreground, while exports to Italy were profitable for the mother country. Infrastructure expansion and urbanization were used primarily to facilitate trade and military control. This economic orientation led to social inequalities and made the development of sustainable local economic systems more difficult. Militarily, Italy depended on the suppression of uprisings. Unlike in British or French colonies, violence was often used as the primary instrument of control to secure authority over rebellious groups. Military strategy was often marked by superiority through modern weapons, systematic repression, and occasional massacres, which both consolidated colonial rule and made it lastingly traumatic. Ideologically, Italy connected economic and military goals with the concept of a civilizing mission, with culture, religion, and education often serving as justification. Schools and missions were established, but the local population remained largely marginalized. Italian colonies, therefore, had a strongly hierarchical structure dominated by violence, which permanently changed African societies. In summary, the Italian colonies in Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia were marked by military violence, direct administration, economic exploitation, and coercive systems. Italy tried late to realize its imperial ambitions through military control and strategic infrastructure, but met considerable resistance. The consequences of colonizations are visible today in social tensions, economic underdevelopment, and political structures in these regions. In the next chapter, we will examine the Spanish colonies in Africa, smaller territories, strategic motivations, and the economic and military practices of Spanish rule. Chapter 13. Spanish colonies in Africa. Spain appeared comparatively late and only to a limited extent in the colonization of Africa. Unlike Great Britain or France, Spain did not have the resources to control large areas comprehensively, economically, and militarily. Spanish colonial policy focused on small coastal areas and strategic positions, especially in Northwest Africa, North Africa, and the Canary Islands, with economic, military, and geopolitical interests in the foreground. The most important Spanish territories on the African continent were Spanish Morocco, Rio de Oro, Spanish Sahara, Ifni, and several enclaves on the northern coast, such as Ceuta and Melilla. These regions served Spain primarily as trading posts, military outposts, and control points along important trade and shipping routes in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Administration was strongly centralized, and military presence played a central role in securing colonial rule. Economically, Spain benefited above all from trade, fishing, and raw material extraction. Especially in the Sahara and North Africa, trading stations were established in order to control local goods, such as salt, fish, and camels for trade with Europe. Plantation agriculture, or large-scale raw material extraction, as in the Belgian or British colonies, played only a subordinate role. The low economic yield reflected Spain's limited resources, but it also led to a pragmatic approach toward local populations. Militarily, Spain relied heavily on fortresses, garrisons, and smaller expeditionary armies to suppress uprisings and resistance. Especially in Morocco, fighting repeatedly broke out, with local tribes that rebelled against land dispossession and colonial control. Spain used a combination of military violence and diplomatic agreements with local leaders to secure its rule. Despite these measures, colonial control often remained fragile because European troops were numerically strongly outnumbered and the resilience of the indigenous population was high. Culturally and ideologically, Spain tried to spread Catholic missionary work and European values. Schools and churches were established to promote religion and education according to the Spanish model, although on a smaller scale than in France or Portugal. Missionary work served both cultural influence and the legitimization of colonial rule, but it could only partly suppress traditional African culture. Spanish colonial policy was overall strategically limited, economically pragmatic, and militarily defensive. Unlike Belgium or Germany, the systematic exploitation of large territories did not stand in the foreground. Instead, Spain tried, with limited means, to secure strategic positions, control trade, and use its presence in international political negotiations. In summary, the Spanish colonies in Africa were characterized by small-scale control, military presence, missionary work, and pragmatic economic use. Although they played a relatively minor role in global colonial history, they had regionally significant effects on trade, culture, and social structures. Spanish enclaves and protectorates served above all to secure trade routes and geopolitical influence, and remain some part of Spain's colonial legacy in Northwest Africa to this day. In the next chapter, we will examine African resistance against colonial powers, uprisings, guerrilla warfare, diplomatic strategies, and the role of African leaders in the struggle against European expansion. Chapter 14. African Resistance Against Colonial Powers. During colonization, the African continent was by no means a passive victim of European expansion. African resistance against colonial powers appeared in many forms, from military uprisings to diplomatic negotiations and cultural and economic subversion. The intensity and organization of resistance depended strongly on local political structures, military strength, and the strategic abilities of African leaders. One outstanding example of military resistance was the Zulu kingdom under Shaka Zulu and his successors. Shaka had already reformed the military structures of his kingdom in the early 19th century, enabling highly organized warfare. When British colonial power later pushed southward, the Zulu used their tactical superiority in several battles, including the famous Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, to temporarily repel the British. Resistance here was not only military, but also culturally motivated. The Zulu defended land, political autonomy, and their social order. In West Africa, empires such as Ashanti, Dahomey, and the Sokoto Caliphate showed effective resistance. The Ashanti Empire fought several times against British expansion in Ghana, while Dahomey armed its soldiers and carried out targeted attacks against French advances. The Sokoto Caliphate, an Islamic empire in present-day Nigeria, used its religious and administrative structures to limit the influence of European powers and maintain local rule. In North Africa, resistance was often closely connected with religious movements. In Algeria, the uprising under Emir Abd al-Qadir from 1832 to 1847 against the French occupation led to years of guerrilla wars in which strategic retreat areas, mobility, and local support were decisive. Despite the military superiority of the French, Abd al-Qadir was temporarily able to maintain control over large parts of Algeria and delay expansion. In East Africa, local resistance movements formed against German and British colonial rule. The Maji-Maji Uprising of 1905 to 1907 in German East Africa was a coordinated revolt in which several groups cooperated in order to attack German plantations, administrative posts, and military facilities. The uprising was brutally suppressed, and thousands of people died. But it shows the determination of African communities to fight colonial rule. Resistance was not always military. Diplomacy, trade, and cultural subversion also played a major role. African leaders used negotiations with several colonial powers to secure advantages, gain territorial concessions, or play conflicts among Europeans against one another. European orders were often undermined through tax evasion, refusal to perform forced labor, or targeted sabotage. Women also played an important role in resistance. In West Africa and Southern Africa, women often took on strategic functions in communities and tribal structures. They organized supplies, support for rebels, and information about colonial advances. Their contribution was long overlooked, but it was decisive for the sustainability of many resistance movements. In summary, African resistance against colonial powers was diverse, strategic, and often persistent. Military uprisings, diplomatic negotiations, guerrilla wars, economic subversion, and cultural resistance showed that African societies were by no means passive. Despite military inferiority, they were able to achieve partial successes, delay the colonial advance, and preserve autonomy. This resistance shaped the colonial experience and left a legacy of political mobilization that later became decisive for independence movement. in the 20th century. In the next chapter, we will analyze the colonial economy and infrastructure. How the European powers used plantations, mines, railways, and ports to control and exploit Africa. Chapter 15. Colonial economy and infrastructure. The European colonial powers in Africa pursued a strictly economically oriented model aimed at exploitation, control of resources, and the integration of the colonies into the world economy. Infrastructure projects, plantations, mining, and trade were central to securing Europe's economic interests, while African societies often benefited only marginally from these developments. One focus of the colonial economy was raw material extraction. Plantations for sugar, coffee, cotton, cocoa, and rubber were established in West Africa, Central Africa, and East Africa. In German Southwest Africa, the Belgian Congo, and the British colonies, mines were created for gold, diamonds, copper, and other valuable minerals. These raw materials were exported to supply industry in Europe. African workers were often compelled to produce through forced labor, taxes in the form of labor services, or military pressure, which led to profound social and economic changes. The colonial powers invested intensively in infrastructure, especially railways, roads, ports, and communication systems. Railway lines in German East Africa, British East Africa, French West Africa, and the Congo primarily served the transport of raw materials to export ports. Roads and bridges enabled rapid troop transport and logistical control, while telegraph lines facilitated communication between administration, military, and trade centers. This infrastructure had both positive and negative long-term effects. It connected regions with one another, facilitated trade and urbanization, but at the same time led to environmental changes and the marginalization of traditional economic routes. Another important element of the colonial economy was tax policy. Local population groups were forced to pay taxes in money or labor in order to finance the colonial administration. This led to a profound change in social structure. Women and children often had to fill production gaps. Village communities were destabilized, and economic dependence on colonial administrations became entrenched. Trade was strictly regulated. European powers established monopolies that controlled the export of raw materials and secured the import of European manufactured goods. Local marksjits were integrated into the colonial system, undermining traditional trade networks between African empires, cities, and regions. At the same time, African entrepreneurs were often denied access to economic self-determination. The social dimension of the colonial economy was considerable. Forced labor, land dispossession, and the shift to export production led to conflicts, migration, and sometimes famines. Traditional production methods, subsistence economies, and community structures were undermined. In many regions, a stratification developed between colonially privileged Africans, European settlers, and oppressed workers, which permanently shaped the social hierarchy. Culturally, the colonial economy also had influence. Plantations, mines, and cities encouraged the migration of workers over long distances, leading to ethnic mixing, language changes, and cultural exchange. Missionaries and administrative institutions used economic dependence to spread education, religion, and European norms, linking economic control closely with ideological rule. In summary, the colonial economy and infrastructure in Africa were structurally oriented towards exploitation and European interests. raw material extraction, plantation agriculture, monopoly trade, forced labor, and infrastructure projects primarily served Europe's profit maximization and the securing of colonial power. At the same time, these systems profoundly changed African societies, led to social inequalities and cultural adaptations, and laid the foundation for Africa's economic integration into the global capitalist order, often at the expense of local autonomy and well-being. In the next chapter, we will examine the social and cultural effects of colonization in greater depth. Education, religion, social changes, and cultural transformations in the colonized regions. Chapter 16. Social and cultural effects of colonization. The colonization of Africa had not only political and economic consequences, but also shaped social structures, cultural identities, and the everyday organization of the population. The European colonial powers introduced administrative structures, education systems, religions, and cultural norms that caused profound long-term changes and continue to have effects in many regions today. One central aspect was the introduction of European education systems. Missionaries and colonial administrations established schools in which reading, writing, and basic administrative skills were taught, often combined with religious instruction. Education was initially aimed at children of indigenous elites, who served as intermediaries between the colonial administration and the local population. Later, broader sections of the population were increasingly included. Education served not only individual qualification, but also social discipline. It transmitted European values, obedience, and loyalty toward the colonial power. Missionary work and religion were additional central tools of the colonial powers. Christian churches, especially Catholic and Protestant ones, established mission stations that combined education, medical care, and religious instruction. The goal was to civilize the African population and integrate it into the colonial system. At the same time, conflicts arose between traditional African religions, Islam and Christianity, causing religious identity to become politicized and sometimes used as a means of control. Social structures were massively changed by colonial administration, forced labor, and land dispossession. Families, village communities, and tribal associations partially lost their economic and political autonomy. The allocation of land to European settlers, the introduction of plantation agriculture, and recruitment for forced labor led to migration, uprooting, and tensions within society. Women in particular bore the burden of maintaining households and agricultural production, while men were deployed on plantations, in mines, or in military service. Culturally, hybridization occurred. European clothing, language, architecture, and administration were introduced, while African traditions, music, dance, and language were partly adapted or displaced. In urban centers, new social classes emerged in which European and African influences mixed. This hybridization led to new cultural forms of expressions that represented both resistance against colonial power and adaptation to new living conditions. Politically, colonization promoted new elites. Some African communities used European education and administrative structures to gain political positions within the colonial system. These elites later played a central role in the independence movements of the 20th century. At the same time, colonial administration reinforced existing hierarchies and privileged certain groups, cementing social inequalities. The health effects were also significant. Missionaries and colonial administrations introduced medical care, but forced labor and land dispossession led to disease, malnutrition, and overburdening of the population. The introduction of Western medicine improved some living conditions, but it could not compensate for the structural problems and social burdens. In summary, the social and cultural effects of Africa's colonization were profound and complex. Education, missionary work, forced labor, land dispossession, and administration changed family structures, social roles, and cultural identity. At the same time, new social classes, hybrid cultures, and political elites emerged and later became decisive for independence movements and modern African society. Colonization, therefore, left a complex legacy of control, adaptation, and cultural transformation that permanently shaped the continent's social dynamics. In the next chapter, we will analyze colonial administrative systems in detail: direct versus indirect rule, bureaucracy, legal systems, and the different strategies of European powers in enforcing colonial control.